Hi, thank you so much, everyone. Welcome to panel 2. Here we are in this wonderful event that we're having today. Excuse me. And this panel today, we're going to be talking a lot about freedom of expression here and Apple, relationally to the double standard that Apple has in the App Store. And so I'm Kathleen O'Keefe. I'm the Training and Campaign Manager with Tibet Action Institute. And I'm filling in for the wonderful Mandy McEwen. She had some family obligations she needed to attend to. So we wish her all the very best. And I just want to briefly introduce this incredible panel that we have today. I'm super honored to be here. And first we have Zumrate Arkin. She's the Program and Advocacy Manager for World Uyghur Congress and working for the Uyghur people in East Turkestan that are gravely oppressed by the Chinese government. And we also have Shanda Gupta. She's the campaign manager at Some of Us, which is an ethical consumer rights organization, and she's been doing incredible work on the Apple campaign. We also have Yacho, a very key China researcher at Human Rights Watch, working on numerous issues with regards to human rights in China. And Pema Doma, here with us from Students for a Free Tibet. She is the campaign director there, and SFT works in solidarity with the Tibetan people for their struggle for rights and freedom. And finally, Glacier Kwong, founder of Keyboard Frontline, an organization that works on technology and internet freedom issues in Hong Kong. And so I welcome you all so much here. Thank you for being here. And so as we have been hearing, folks who've tuned in earlier today and who have been following the campaign and these issues, Apple is widely considered to be a leader, right? They consider themselves for sure a leader in access to internet, and they bolster themselves as a defender of freedom of expression and privacy. In fact, their website says privacy is a fundamental human right. And their executives say freedom of expression is as well. And however, there is a very deep and disturbing double standard when it comes to iOS in any region under China's rule, and also Russia as well. Apple does not have the same standards with how they allow access to information, to apps, to VPNs, to things like the New York Times. None of these things are allowed in China's version of the App Store for Apple, whereas in more open and free societies, the apps are there, VPNs are there, and so this is quite unethical and really does not line up with these statements that privacy and freedom of expression are fundamental human rights. It's not equal for all people in Apple's world, which has wide-ranging implications and which our panelists will be outlining. And so I'd like to invite our panelists to give an opening statement about their work, and I'd like to invite Glacier, if you don't mind going and letting us know. Thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Glacier. I'm currently in Hong Kong, and I'll be sharing a bit on a recent case regarding the movement in Hong Kong in 2019, where there is an obvious double standard of freedom of speech and freedom of expression or freedom of assembly on the Apple App Store regarding a Hong Kong crowdsourced app called hkmap.live. And this was an app designed for protesters and citizens to locate where are the protests and where are the police in order to enable them to avoid troubles and alert users of police vehicles, armed officers, and incidents in which people have been injured. And there is also a website version that was also active at the time, and it displays hotspots on the map of the city that is continuously updated as user reports incidents. And in October, the app was taken down after the Chinese government made a statement via their propaganda machine Apple's Daily, and where they said that by allowing its platform, which is Apple's platform, to clear the way for an app that incites illegal behavior, does Apple not worry about the damaging its reputation and hurting the feelings of the consumers, which they're implying Chinese consumers and consumers that are living under the Communist Party's rule. And this is a huge problem that we see. And then later, after some disputes, the app was finally allowed on the App Store again, but it clearly illustrates the double standard that Apple has, and it says that it is complying to national and local laws, which doesn't make any sense. That if the local law is violating human rights, there's no way that Apple should comply with the logic and twisted concepts. And I think in the future, after the national security law that is supposedly to be introduced at the end of June, I'm very convinced that there will be more of these situations happening. Maybe New York Times or other foreign press apps would get banned on the Hong Kong version App Store as well, because it's kind of like introducing foreign intervention into Hong Kong, and that is a huge problem. And I think Apple is bowing down to the Communist Party's twisted logic because it's fear that it might lose its ability to manufacture iPhones in China, or it will lose the Chinese market because it's so large. But I don't think any country should bundle the support to its regime with its markets, because trade should happen on a fair and equal basis, not under threat or threatening to ban anyone from its market. And I really see there will be an increasing trend of white terror and self-censorship regarding Apple after the national security law is introduced. This is so far I've got. Let's discuss later in the Q&A session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Glacier. Next, we'll have Zumrate from World Reader Congress. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. So concerning Apple and the region or East Turkestan, we know that last year Apple confirmed that the Uyghurs have been the target of attacks because of an iPhone security flaw. And we also know that this was pointed out earlier by Google Project Zero researchers, who reported that 5 security flaws kind of made it possible to hack users' iPhones in certain communities over a period of 2 years. And this was reported that it was aimed at monitoring Uyghurs specifically. And what this was about was that the installed malwares could potentially steal user files, access their iOS keychains, monitor their location data. The whole sophisticated system access could also give the attackers the opportunity to read or listen to communication sent through encrypted messaging services like Signal, WhatsApp that we frequently use, and also log into social media and communication accounts. And following that disclosure, Apple, in response, they try to downplay the issue as an isolated incident that was affecting the Uyghur community. But he did not, Tim Cook in response, or Apple as a company, they did not take into account the unprecedented surveillance the Uyghur population is subjected to due to China's repressive technologies and policies. And if we look at the whole mass surveillance state, we know that China's security and surveillance apparatus has substantially increased the scope and influence, especially since the arrival of Chen Chuango as the party secretary to the region in 2016. Urban areas are divided into grid with increased police presence and surveillance. Each zone is equipped with dense network of security cameras, checkpoints, and even convenience police stations, which Uyghurs have to go through every time they go in a new place. And we also know that DNA samples, fingerprints, iris scans, blood types of all the residents in the region between the ages of 12 and 65 were collected from 18.8 million of people in 2017, given some sources. And mass collection of personal data from CCTV scanners, facial recognition software, public databases, police checkpoints, and even, like I said, DNA and blood samples are analyzed in large data hubs. So given all this general context and this background on the mass surveillance state in East Turkestan, Apple is choosing to be blind if they're not responding to that. By complying with China's regulations on censorship, Apple really chooses to side with these policies, and it reflects their stand on the ongoing mass surveillance state and the ongoing oppression, systemic discrimination and racism in China, and particularly Uyghurs, who face significant restrictions on digital activity. So I think that if Uyghurs choose to use iPhones, they expect as consumers a minimum amount of digital security, and Apple, and they also expect Apple to address this situation quickly, because in East Turkestan, their lives depend on it. Because given the whole surveillance state, their life really depends on it, because they could end up in jail or in an internment camp because of it. And like my colleague last year said, Apple's rhetoric is that they say we comply with local laws and protect there's the safety of their consumers and employees, but they're selective of that, and we have not seen that being applied in the Uyghur region. And also, I agree that if those local laws are designed to oppress a whole ethnic group, then maybe Apple should revisit their business plans with China, or have a conversation, or take a firmer stance on China. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so far we've heard of two different versions of how Apple is complicit with the government of China in different forms of repression. And so now we're going to hear from Pema Doma from Students for Free Tibet. Thank you, Pema.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I noticed that there's a lot of Tibetan folks that are tuning in as well. 아니 남부서 참말라 다시들레 드린디 먼저기 믹스기디 구쇼 적속한 기고라 돌렌디 배웠다 같은 전부 아니디 네 삼전네 믹스기 퍼버라이나 님은 딱바 개춘부 쇼시를 딘드라 레군콜라데스 하코가디 개춘부 쇼시를 이네 단조 드린디 레군 사마디 인게네 두기래. So thank you so much for joining. And I am really grateful to everyone who has taken the time to really learn more about the Apple campaign, and in particular, how it impacts human rights situations for Tibetans and for Uyghurs, as Zumratai has just talked about, and as well for Hong Kongers. And I think in particular that as a Tibetan myself and as a young person, I can see how Apple's role as a tech leader around the world and their complicity with the CCP censorship has made a big impact on everyday young people who, are oftentimes their voices are not heard. And so I really want to use this opportunity today to amplify some of their stories. Inside Tibet, there have been so many countless circumstances in which, young Tibetans are being persecuted for their, right to freedom of expression, for them expressing their personal views or opinions. And that's not just only publicly. I want to give some specific examples, such as a 22-year-old Tibetan who was named Sonam Palden. He was arrested by the CCP after posting on WeChat about the importance of Tibetan language and about Tibetan language rights. He posted about the poor state of Tibetan language preservation under the CCP occupation, under Chinese rule. And because of those opinions that he expressed on the digital space, he was actually arrested. There's also, for example, young people, such as just as recently as last year, Yongten, who is a Tibetan nomad, who is just a little bit younger than I am today, marked the 145th Tibetan inside Tibet to self-immolate since 2009. And I do believe that self-immolation is an act of protest. But as a Tibetan, I can so personally and deeply understand what type of situation an individual must be in order to commit an act such as self-immolation. And what I saw was that in a young person like Yongten, who is a nomad, who is a Tibetan and a Buddhist, like for him to take this act, it shows that there is no other way for him to express his views, his political views, his personal views and religious views. And we can see that there's this climate being created inside Tibet, a climate in which free expression is stifled in any possible way by the CCP. And then enter a company like Apple, which is possibly the biggest tech company the world has ever seen. And Apple plays a major role in setting the precedence of what does the internet mean? What does innovation mean for society and for those that are the most vulnerable to oppression in our society? And I think that, for example, today we had just shared a quote from Apple CEO Tim Cook, which says, "With every breath we take, we must commit to being that change and to creating a better, more just world for everyone." And so when you have a leader like Tim Cook, who is known, his face is known around the world, and his message of equality and human rights and justice is heard around the world, yet inside Tibet, the voices of young people like Sonam Palden and Yongten are stifled every single day. And I like to believe that Apple is a company that cares about privacy and digital security. But what we've seen in the past few years with Apple's, time and time again, their decisions and their actions, and the way that they impact Tibetans and Uyghurs and Hong Kongers on the ground. As a young person who's living in a democratic, free country, you start to question what the true morals and integrity of a company like Apple are. And so that's kind of what, in my opinion, this campaign is all about. It is about young people who have the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, taking the opportunity to question a company that they, are very, in many cases, very loyal to. I've been an Apple user since I was 15, 16 years old. My first laptop was a MacBook. And the same freedom that MacBook has provided me for a young person my age inside Tibet, that Apple logo has now become a symbol of surveillance and censorship. So it's really about holding companies that we respect in free countries to uphold those values for everyone and not create two classes of citizens as we move into a new generation, a generation where internet is ubiquitous with freedom. And how do we continue strengthening the ties between innovation and freedom as opposed to innovation and oppression? Thank you for that. And I'm sure we'll have much more discussion, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Pema. Yeah, that quote was from a letter to Apple employees, if people don't know, and it was after the murder of George Floyd here in the US. And it's interesting, there's this old saying, actions speak louder than words, right? And so Apple really has these grand words that they say and perhaps do mean to a degree, but are not willing to put those beliefs into action when it's tough. And I've been having conversations with friends about, being an ally means being an ally when it's hard, not just when it's easy. And so I'm happy that we're here today to really challenge Apple to be an ally to people who are oppressed by the CCP because it's hard, not just because it's easy. So wonderful, thank you. And Yacho from Human Rights Watch, you are next. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to participate in this. Our co-panelists talked about how Apple users in Hong Kong, in Tibet, and also in East Turkestan are affected by Apple's, lack of integrity, I would say. I'm going to speak a little bit about how Apple's policies affecting users to Chinese regular users and also activists. I've been talking to a lot of activists over the years, and I've also tried to help them to get secure VPN, help them to tell them how to use the VPNs. I think over the years, the situation has been getting worse and worse. In 2017, Apple removed 674 VPN from the App Store in China, and then after that, they continuously move VPNs from the App Store. People are telling me it's getting extremely hard to get a VPN so they can access to information that are censored by the Chinese government, foreign websites, especially foreign Chinese language websites. It's just getting Apple has, but there are still VPNs on Apple's in China's App Store that you can find, but those VPNs are authorized by the Chinese government, which means the Chinese government is able, or very likely able, to see what websites you're logging to, knowing that you're using the VPN to log on to websites that are censored in China. So basically, you're a sanctioned, authorized VPN just means that you can see those websites, but the Chinese government knows what you're doing. So those are not safe. As activists and even regular users have been telling me how they're annoyed by just the extent that they have to go through to read the news, and also they are worried and afraid because even they can read the news, they know that the channels they're using to read the censored news is not safe. Also, they're angry because Apple has this good reputation and this powerful and a wonderful company, and they're not doing things that they should do to help Chinese users to be able to access information that are censored by the Chinese government. And also in 2018, China moves the iCloud data to the storage to be based in China, which made it much easier for the Chinese government to access the data. And people are worried about that because it's, whatever they do with their iPhone is no longer safe. Apple might feel, as long as, I comply with, the Chinese laws, I would be fine. But first of all, as the co-panelists mentioned, if those laws are violating international human rights standards, international human rights laws, Apple should not comply with those abusive Chinese laws. Secondly, look back, what happened, if we look at what happened to Yahoo handed the information of 2 Chinese journalists to the Chinese government, in the early 2000s, and both of the journalists were sentenced to 10 years. People still remember this incident. Every time when people write about Apple, they cite this incident of Yahoo because it is still causing Yahoo, reputational damage. And Apple should keep this in mind. If this happened to Apple, if somebody, actors who were sentenced to lengthy sentence, and because of Apple has made it very easy for the Chinese government to access the data, it will continue to cost Apple reputational damage. It's understandable that why Apple is doing this, because China is a huge market. It's the 3rd largest market for Apple. The vast majority of Apple's products are assembled in China. So, but this is not an excuse to continue to kowtow into the Chinese government. And I think ultimately companies should work together, because this is not only happening to Apple, it's happening to other big tech companies like, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Zoom very recently. I think companies should unite together to push back the Chinese government. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really good point about Apple's reputation, and they are coming under fire more and more around human rights issues and around how they handle their developers. They're having their conference today with developers, many of whom are working really hard to make apps that will get pulled from the app stores because they're in violation of unknown domestic laws in China. So thank you for those thoughts, because Apple's reputation is everything to the company. Their brand is based on their reputation. And so we really want to help them see that this is actually also in their best interest. So if we can close now the openings with Shonda from Some of Us.
Hello. And firstly, thank you to my co-panelists for showing us just how decisions made in Silicon Valley's boardrooms that disregard human rights have such real negative effects on people's lives. That Apple is so vocal about human rights in the USA and Europe while quietly acquiescing to a government with a horrifying human rights record is not only rank hypocrisy. It runs counter to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which clearly states that businesses must respect human rights, which includes freedom of expression, wherever they operate, and they must do this regardless of the government's position. Removing VPNs, podcast apps, news services, and so on in China clearly isn't doing that. Nobody's values should change depending on where they are, Apple included, which is why we submitted a shareholder proposal to Apple's last AGM, which called on the company's board of directors to report annually on its policies and practices addressing freedom of expression and access to information. By having this on record, we will be able to more effectively hold the company to account. After initially trying to exclude our proposal from consideration, Apple recommended that shareholders vote against it, not surprisingly. However, shareholders increasingly view human rights risks not as separate to business concerns, but as integral to them, and a massive 40.6% of shareholders voted for our proposal. Encouragingly, such a high vote required institutional investors to side with human rights against Apple's wishes, and they did. Advisors ISS and Glass Lewis both recommended a vote for, and investors like Boston Common Asset Management and United Church Funds voted in support. Their reasoning was that the explicit gap in Apple's current human rights approach presents a material risk for both the company and its shareholders. And given the progression of world events since February's AGM, I can only imagine that Apple's shareholders are becoming more concerned about this material risk, not less. So Tim Cook will be well advised to put the policies and practices in place that ensures his company's mission genuinely will be to create technology that empowers people to change the world for the better, rather than that being a meaningless soundbite wheeled out whenever the PR moment demands.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's an incredible ground we've just laid here. So thank you all for those statements. And I think I want to start by circling back to this notion of powerlessness that Apple says that they have in terms of just following domestic laws. We know they must know about human rights violations on the ground in China and East Turkestan and Tibet and Hong Kong. They're surely following this. And as was mentioned, if they're putting out these very grand statements about freedom of expression, I wonder if you all could speak to just how would you counter this notion of powerlessness? Apple is one of the biggest corporations in the world. And so what would you say to that? And anyone who wants to speak can join in.
I can say something. I mean, I think it's interesting how Apple claims it's powerless in this regard. It is one of the biggest corporations in the world, and I was just looking up the stat about Apple's GDP bigger than X numbers of countries. I can't remember how many countries it is, but it's something staggering. And of course, Apple is very selective about when it stands up to authority. It did stand up to the US government and the FBI when they wanted to access a suspect's iPhone, and refused to do that on the grounds of privacy. So if it can do that in the US, it can do that elsewhere. Yes, China is a huge market for Apple, but so are the Americas, right? So it's just, the argument doesn't really stack up. I guess they just rely on the fact that maybe people don't know so much, the news won't reach them about what's happening. And I guess that's, our job to make sure that we do keep raising these issues with Apple and with Apple customers worldwide, so that everyone is aware that the company that they may look to favorably for its stance on human rights and equality is very selective on how it applies that.
Thank you. Glacier, I saw your microphone, or yeah, either.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think as an activist or a Hong Konger, the thing that we find it kind of difficult to address this powerlessness, because I myself, as kind of loyal Apple user. My phone and my laptop are both Apple products, and sometimes it's very frustrated that Apple claims itself as a human rights defender, that it will not give back doors to the US government, and it says freedom of speech is something that it values. But at the same time, in Hong Kong, they do have their own approach of dealing with human rights standards in Hong Kong, and also in China, for example, in Tibet or in Xinjiang or Tibet, and it's very worrying. And I think the thing that we do in Hong Kong is we sometimes switch to other regions' app store to circumvent the fact that there is something that's not available in Hong Kong. But in the case of the app that I mentioned, hkmap.live, it's actually being banned or being taken down in the world. So any version of the app store have no access to that app during the time that Apple took it down. So it's very difficult. We can only rely on the app version of the whole service in order to do the same to exercise the same functions. It's very frustrating because the web version of that app doesn't really work well on the phone. You have to use a computer, but then it will defeat the purpose that try to warn you about where is the protest taking place and so on. And I am not very satisfied with Apple's approach of saying that they have to comply with local laws, because it's fundamental human rights that everybody should be able to enjoy it no matter where we are or who we are. And Apple's approach is actually self-defeating with its claim that it is a human rights defender. And I find it very frustrated that the world does not pay enough attention to these kind of double standards, because it doesn't only happen to Apple, but also other tech companies as well. And I think we need more discussion and more discourse on this kind of effects on this kind of double standard, because these kind of companies now play a fundamental role in they are even more powerful than governments, because they actually hold more data than any government can. They hold data of basically all the people that has an access to an Apple phone, which I believe is a huge number. And while we rely so much on a device to be connected to the internet in order to do our daily routines, I think it's really important that we start addressing the problem of these kind of double standards, because it really kind of like classified people into different classes. For example, those who have access to New York Times and those who doesn't, and it actually symbolize an access to information and what kind of information you can get your hands on. And I think it's very important that we have this kind of discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Yacho, you had your mic off.
Hi. I think Apple's powerless is not necessarily true, because the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy has so much relied on the economic development. The Chinese government needs Apple to be in China. I mean, as I said earlier, the vast majority of Apple's products are manufactured in China, assembled in China. That means tens of thousands of jobs. And the Chinese government needs those people to be employed so they don't revolt against the government. So Apple absolutely have, how does Apple, leverage that to speak with the Chinese government? Secondly, I feel, Apple has been citing complying with local laws, but the removal of VPNs is not based on Chinese law. We, Human Rights Watch, have written letters to Apple. Also, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, David Kay, also wrote to Apple asking, where are the laws? What laws are you citing when you say, when you remove the VPNs? What did the Chinese government tell you? What's your, communication with the Chinese government? There's no law saying that you cannot tell the world, what the Chinese government told you and what your response. So, even complying with local law, this idea is, is not entirely true, because a lot of the actions Apple take has no basis in Chinese law.
If I could just add something quickly, I agree with all my co-panelists said, and I also think that this argument or rhetoric is kind of weak, because this is not, they're clearly being selective, and it's not just Apple, it's also other tech companies or other companies that have, recently, as we know, there are a lot of companies that were involved in the Uyghur forced labor, and now it's a matter of being on the right side of history. And like Yacho mentioned earlier, Yahoo, what happened with Yahoo a couple of years ago, Now, if you ask people, like, no one really uses Yahoo, and that kind of impacted years later. So it's about Apple's reputation, and as consumers, we have real leverage. And also, Apple, as a big tech company based in, big company, they have real leverage as well on China, as Yachao mentioned it too, because China relies on its economic power, and they rely on these companies. So it's really being on the right side of history and not choosing human rights above a business, but I think it's possible to do both at the same time, do business, but also respect human rights. So I think we as consumers, we have real leverage, but also tech companies, other companies have real leverage on China.
I think, like, I'm sure you might have more questions, Kathy, but building off of what Zumreta is talking about, choosing human rights over profits, I think that's like an important precedence that not just tech companies, but a lot of corporations around the world need to start actually addressing that question head on. But I also would like to say that Apple's decision to present itself as being powerless to the face of the Chinese government's pressure in terms of censorship, it's not genuine. It's just kind of a way that they can brand themselves in a certain way, the same way that in democratic countries they've branded themselves as the leader of digital security. It's not an accident. I think they do it intentionally, in order to gain larger market shares and in order to boost their margin of profit. And the reality is, outside of the Chinese market, where there are a lot of freedoms, in 2008, 40% of Apple's consumers were below the age of 34. That is the age of, a lot of people who care about digital security. There are a lot of activists. There are a lot of, human rights conscious individuals within that age range. So Apple knows that in a certain region, they need to, export a certain messaging and marketing, whereas in another, in order to gain the profits, they have to have a different message. So I think that the idea that Apple is choosing between human rights and profits, and that's going to be the decision-making process kind of that happens inside Tibet. While it is valid in one way, it also has proven itself false on the outside, because it shows that Apple can try to have, they try to have their cake and eat it as well. They try to be the tech human rights leader and also silence Tibetans and Uyghurs and Hong Kongers at the same time. So that's kind of, I think, where it's really important for us to also focus on pressuring Apple to, pick a side. Like, if they choose to censor Tibetans and Uyghurs and stand with the CCP in this idea of silencing dissidents and complying with censorship, that's a decision that they would make. But they cannot also market themselves as a human rights conscious brand that cares about digital security, because that way consumers can make the right decision. They can make the decision that fits them. But right now, what Apple is doing is presenting themselves in one way and then acting and behaving in another behind closed doors in parts of the world where the realities and stories of individuals and young people are not being heard by the larger, community. And also, I wanted to mention about the precedents that Apple is setting, that it's okay, as long as you are powerless, it's okay to censor and surveil vulnerable communities and vulnerable peoples. And as technology advances, that level of censorship and surveillance is only going to get heightened. And if Apple, as the world's biggest tech leader in 2020, sets the precedence that as long as you're powerless, it's okay to do these things for the purposes of business and profits, then 10 years from now, in 2030, what are the other tech companies going to be doing, and in what regions of the world? Some countries might have stable democracies today, but in 2030 or 2040 or 2050, other democracies may erode. And there may be, leaders in other countries that are not so friendly to digital security and do not care about human rights as much. So this is not just a Tibet or Hong Kong or East Turkestan problem. The question of balancing human rights and transparency with profits is a question that applies to everyone, because the more technology innovates, the more vulnerable all people are, at the mercy of tech companies and their decision making and their morals and integrity.
Yeah, thank you, Pema. Actions today absolutely affect what happens tomorrow. I think that's a really good point. And I think, Shonda, you have a quote specifically from Tim Cook on profits versus rights.
Yes, and before I shared it, I just wanted to talk about how, another instance of Apple standing up to government was in the UK very recently with the government's test track and trace coronavirus app. They wanted a centralized system of data, and Apple felt that wasn't private enough and refused to work with the government and turn the government down in making that app for them because it wasn't secure enough and would leave people open to their data being harvested. So it is interesting how Apple does choose. And on this question of profits, obviously with the World Developers Conference today, Apple's Tim Cook's been doing the news rounds, and he's quoted as saying today that, there was a time back many years ago when CEOs were just supposed to focus on profits only and not so much the constituencies. And that's never been my view. I never subscribed to that. So again, we're hearing very warm words from Tim Cook, but not matched with the action he could take to actually make this a reality. And it's well within his grasp to make this a reality.
Yeah, Shonda, I wonder if you could continue with that in terms of the shareholder resolution, because I think we're seeing that unless pushed and forced to, Apple will continue this duplicity, this double standard. They'll continue saying beautiful things like that quote you just had, when we all know the real reality on the ground for people is devastating. And so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the shareholder resolution and your hope for that in this next round. So it'll be coming back up again at the next AGM in February, presumably. And yeah, how are you feeling about that?
Yeah, so Apple has quite a long history of excluding shareholder proposals that talk about human rights. And certainly when we put ours in, the first contact we received from Apple was from their lawyer trying to exclude this proposal. The SEC didn't buy Apple's arguments and allowed our proposal to go ahead. I think Apple, whether willfully or because they don't understand, will often cite their stance on privacy when we're talking about human rights and freedom of expression, and so tend not to. Sorry, my cat is now joining the call, it seems. So they'll tend to sidestep the issue by talking about their privacy, which of course doesn't actually hold water for the countries that we're talking about today either. But regardless of Apple's insistence at trying to exclude the proposal, it did go ahead, and we were able to communicate with shareholders and investor firms who did actually come out to support the proposal. And as I said, we got a 40% vote from shareholders this year in February, which is pretty high for a first-time proposal, and also a proposal that the company recommended a vote against. And so we will be refiling that proposal this year. The deadline to file that is sometime in early September for the shareholder meeting in next February. There's always a long time span for the shareholder work. But the way the world is happening is moving now with our concerns around coronavirus and human rights and the other test track and trace and track apps that I've just been talking about. These concerns about freedom of expression and privacy aren't going to go away. They're going to only become more pertinent. We're seeing more and more news from Hong Kong and from China that is raising concerns about the CCP's policies around freedom of expression. And so I don't see how Apple shareholders who are concerned about the gap in Apple's attitude to human rights was a problem this year. It's not going to be any less of a problem by the end of this year. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to secure more shareholder support to really force this issue on the company. It would be wonderful, of course, that we don't have to wait nearly a year. And maybe Apple will finally respond to our emails and our messages and our letters and come to talk to us about this problem and set out a program of work in advance of us putting the shareholder resolution in, so they don't need to be embarrassed at their next shareholder meeting.
Thank you. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to say on that front? If not, I can have some other questions.
And I think, there were previous proposals. So the 40%, is really good. I think there were previous proposals that the support rate was only in single digit. So I think, you know, there's an increased awareness of this issue, and there's an increased discontent from shareholders with regard to Apple's behavior in China. So I think that's a very positive thing. And, you know, I work on other issues, and I definitely see increased pushback from governments around the world with regard to Chinese behavior. It's very obvious in the past 2 years. You know, EU, I think right now, or a few hours ago, they're having, you know, the EU and China summit. And yesterday, on Friday, they had a resolution out on China, which, you know, they are going to address the Hong Kong national security law. They're going to take more actions. So I think both in the government world, also in the company, in the business world, there's more awareness, and I see a more pushback. So, you know, that's a very positive thing.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the two the organizations that tell shareholders their recommendation on should they vote for something or not, was basically saying what we said before about this is in their best interest, actually, to get more alignment around freedom of expression. And I think it does that 40.6% first go round for this particular resolution, not for the past, and that giant jump really does show there's much more of an appetite right now for people to really want companies to walk the talk. They want to put their money in places that they feel good about. It seems like that is happening more and more. Zumrate, I wanted to ask you, so I've heard that a lot of Uyghur folks have been not using iPhones and going back to much older phones. And I feel like this is, you know, a moment because Apple is letting people down and people don't feel safe on those phones with this double standard. Could you speak about that a little bit and what that impact is on people who are having to sort of go backwards while Apple is moving forwards?
Yeah, I think following that incident, people kind of started maybe losing trust in Apple products, but I wouldn't be able to tell you if there's a growing increase or interest in having feature phones, because I can't contact my family members. I have absolutely no connection with my families in the Uyghur region because of my advocacy work. So I won't be able to tell you if, you know, they stop using Apple products. I don't know, or any. I have no contact. What I hear is people who still have contact and in some ways, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the case if people started using feature phones, because as I told you before, the monitoring of their daily lives is very deep and they are constantly monitored. So even if they did use these products, the Chinese government would always find a way to keep monitoring them. So maybe using feature phones would be the best for them, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what exactly is happening on the ground because of the lack of transparency from the Chinese government, but also the lack of access to information.
So yeah, I mean, that just circles again. We just keep going through these circles. It's sort of unending that Apple's actions just keep having effects on the ground, right? So this, like the fact that you can't communicate with your family there because people, at least if they're on iPhones, can't easily have a VPN, a virtual private network that can allow them to not be tracked and surveilled. It is devastating and really needs to be brought into the forefront for Apple, this connection. And I think there is this disconnect. It feels like, and it's true not just with Apple, as people have said, with lots of corporations, this disconnect between what their actions are literally doing to people. So Glacier, I wanted to ask you a question. If you could speak a little bit more about the security law that's coming up. And you mentioned that you think that Apple will certainly be potentially pulling more apps like the New York Times and such. Can you speak more about what you think will happen with companies like Apple, Google, during that, and where you think the leverage is with regard to this security law and these companies, if any?
For me, I think the national security law will be an excuse for the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government to ask Apple or other, for example, Google, to remove many apps from the App Store. For example, foreign press apps or apps like VPN or two-step authenticator, those kind of things, because that will hinder its approach of carrying out sort of mass surveillance in Hong Kong. And this will hinder the access of information and the ability for users to encrypt their messages or safeguard their own information in this regard. Because in China, we see that they're not allowed to use apps like WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal, and they are forced to use apps that are accessible for the Chinese government, and they have firewalls built in those communication apps. And this is actually making a lot of people very afraid of trying to talk about relatively sensitive topics. And there are censored words, even like Winnie the Pooh, because that's actually kind of mocking Xi Jinping, and it's not allowed in China. And I don't think it will take place immediately after the law is implemented in Hong Kong, but it will happen gradually. And there will be fear and white terror snowballed into a state where Hong Kongers will ultimately lose all freedom of speech, because they are afraid of speaking up, because they will see very soon that people are being arrested for saying something that is sensitive, or they are using the tools that are deemed not okay for the Communist Party. And it will encourage Apple or other tech companies to engage in self-censorship, because I'm very sure that they will be made responsible for helping or aiding the spread of so-called subversion messages. For example, if activists are posting information on Facebook regarding Hong Kong independence or other messages that the Communist Party does not want to see, and they will make the platform responsible for not taking them down. And it will only encourages Apple or Google or other tech companies to engage in more self-censorship, to evade from legal responsibility that is under this new law. And this will greatly hinder the access of information and create a lot of white terror in the city. And I really think there is not a lot of ways to circumvent that, unless we are able to teach people to use tools that will help them evade or get rid of like this kind of monopoly of Apple or other tech companies. But it's very difficult, because not everybody has that level of digital literacy to be able to know the right tools to use or the right ways to defend themselves against surveillance. And it's very worrying in Hong Kong. But I think it will not happen immediately, but it will happen gradually, and ultimately Hong Kong will be nothing but an ordinary Chinese city, that we lost all our diversity or liberty of the city that makes us so special at the first place.
Yeah, thank you. That leads me to thinking about if folks have our panelists here and folks who are listening in. There's been quite a few articles in the BBC recently and around and about Apple in terms of, like you mentioned, in terms of monopoly. And so there's been some discussion, and I very much hope it comes up with developers at their conference that's happening right now. It's been specifically talked about with how they treat developers in terms of the percentage they take, but also this notion that if your app gets pulled from the App Store, that there's anti-competition, antitrust, at least in the US laws about this. And I wondered if anyone wants to speak to that, because as you mentioned, Glacier, like right now, there's not a lot of workaround. There is some workaround, but I've heard for the HK Map Live app that you do need to be a bit tech savvy. And so that's not that's not good enough, obviously, for people. So if anyone can speak to that a little bit, it could be an exciting moment, because we've spoken about potentially third-party VPNs being able to be allowed. So this notion of this closed ecosystem that's completely closed and Apple controls it all, could change. Seems possible if these anti-competition laws come up. So I wonder if anyone can speak to that a little bit. Well, we can't hear you, Shonda.
I'm sorry, I double muted for some reason.
No worries.
I suppose that Apple does have a fairly effective monopoly, which probably is one of the things that gives it some cover and some leeway in saying one thing and doing another. There's very little, as we said, sort of few other places one can go. And so breaking that monopoly or that monopoly behavior should give us more room to hold Apple accountable and to make the company behave in a way that's consistent to its values, because clearly it would become more at risk of losing customers and losing income if it is, if people are more easily able to go elsewhere. So I think this does pose quite a risk for Apple, and I think this underlines what we were saying before, that human rights and good business aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They do go hand in hand, especially in a situation where Apple can't behave like a dictator and run the show all on its own. So I think it will be, as you say, it could be a very a key moment in which we can break this behavior that Apple has become embedded in, really.
Yeah, that will be interesting to follow for sure as time happens. I'm going to change track a little bit. Pema, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the fact that Apple was, I believe, the first to have Tibetan language included in their platform. And so there is some loyalty, I understand, among certain Tibetan communities because of that, because that was a huge deal to have Tibetan language available. And so I wonder if you can speak about that, and particularly in terms of then the potential vulnerability for Tibetans on the ground as a result of this sort of goodwill that seems to exist between Apple and Tibetan community.
Yeah, I think that if you look holistically at the Tibetan community, there are a lot of Tibetans who have brand loyalty with Apple, and I think a lot of that rests in the decision that Apple made in 2010 to incorporate Tibetan language keyboard, which was, as you mentioned, one of the first to do so. With Tibetans have spent so many years, decades, being kind of silenced and having their language and their culture slowly eroded intentionally by the CCP. So I think for many Tibetans, especially older Tibetans who don't know how to read and write in English or other languages, having that accessibility to Tibetan language on their phone was a big game changer. And I think this goes back, directly to the comment that Tim Cook made today that I think it was Shonda had mentioned about, serving his constituencies. And I can tell you for a fact that I personally know many Tibetans who use Apple products and also have family inside Tibet. And these are people who are living in the United States, in India, and some of the world's largest democracies. And I've heard stories from them about how they cannot even speak to their own parents, folks that are, human rights activists and haven't spoken to, their parents for many years now. And nearly all of these people are in the same age range as me or younger, or, around the same range, which is really heartbreaking because Apple claims to serve its constituencies. And that should include Tibetans and young Tibetans who are separated from their families due to, one of the longest standing protracted refugee situations in the world, one of the like one of the worst occupations that the world has seen today. And even for example, right now where there's these massive cases of coronavirus, and in some of the cities, like in New York City, for example, where there is, like the worst case of coronavirus that you can imagine anywhere in the world, like in Queens, where there's also the largest Tibetan community living outside of Asia, many of whom have family inside Tibet. And when I spoke to some of my friends who have family inside Tibet, they actually told me very, very personally that they cannot even tell their families about the situation or how they're doing, or that, hey mom, I don't have coronavirus. And there's no news going in or out through legal ways that the CCP approves of. There's no news going into Tibet about how these Tibetans living in New York are doing. And New York City, Elmhurst is one of the largest communities of Tibetans. And I heard from a friend of mine who was saying that they cannot even tell their own parents that about how the situation is for them in New York or in any city that they might be in with coronavirus, because the Chinese government, the CCP, is monitoring people's conversations and surveils the most intimate conversations people have with their own family. And when people use terms like coronavirus, that's immediately being censored, and that's immediately causing trouble for people inside Tibet, and also I'm sure in East Turkestan and other regions of China. And then when you look at the case, for example, of Anya Sengda and his brother Jimtri, they were climate activists, they were environmentalists. And when you look at the record of when they were sentenced, they went through, they were arrested by the Chinese government for their work in climate activism. And when you look at their trials, some of the evidence used against them was literally transcripts of conversations that they've had on messaging apps that are, surveilled by the CCP. So these are like private conversations they're having with individuals they know within their community. And these are now being used as evidence within court cases. And Anya Sengda just recently had his appeal about a week ago, and his appeal was denied. So he's spending 7 years in prison for his work as a climate activist. And his brother Jimtri last year, due to unknown causes, but one can assume the poor living conditions as a political prisoner under the CCP, passed away after being detained for over a year by the Chinese government. So these are real life implications, not just people on the ground in Tibet, but even their families living outside of Tibet, of how the CCP has directly used technology to, harm the lives of Tibetans, and yet they claim to serve constituencies of, serve their constituencies. And they've added the Tibetan language keyboard, which has created a warm feeling towards Apple amongst many Tibetans, because it's a feeling of representation that many Tibetans yearn for, like especially for accessibility reasons. And then now to see that they're clearly making decisions that go against the safety of the same constituencies that they claim to protect and claim to value and respect. So it does raise a lot of questions about the hypocrisy that Apple decision makers such as Tim Cook, have been engaging in. But thank you for the question, Kathy.
Yeah, and I think that links really well into this other bigger picture that, Apple's complicity with the Chinese government. I didn't know that those messaging apps, those conversations were brought into the trial. I mean, that is really something that executives at Apple really need to take a hard look at. And, we know here that the Chinese government is using companies like Apple to erode norms, global standards, global norms on privacy, on freedom of expression. This is not happening in a vacuum, So when Apple says, "Oh, we're powerless to do anything about it," what they're actually doing is allowing the Chinese government to move the goalposts. They're moving it across the world, and so. They're advancing their political agenda. And Yacho, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the fact that this goalpost moving on global norms is not just about Apple, but there's lots of foreign companies that are engaging in this, and how potentially could they respond together to maybe create a more powerful base?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, we all know the incidents with the NBA. Basically, the general manager of Houston Rockets sitting in the U.S., made a tweet supporting Hong Kong protesters on Twitter, a platform that is blocked in China. So anything that he did was in the US, tweeting on a platform that Chinese people can't even see. And even that, the Chinese government had compelled NBA to censor this person. You can see the extent that the Chinese government is going to censor not people just in China, but also people outside of China. And we also know LinkedIn, which has a presence in China, they're censoring certain information, certain articles, or also certain profiles of users in China. Also, Microsoft is being, the search engine also filters certain search results. There are many other examples, not just tech companies, but other big business that have a presence in China. I mean, it's understandable that if each company alone faces a choice between submitting to Beijing censorship demands and denied access to the huge Chinese market, many companies would choose for groveling. But if companies band together to stand up to the government's bullying, the balance of power would shift. The Chinese government can't get rid of all foreign companies. The government needs, the foreign companies for economic development, for creating jobs. I think companies should talk to each other. Apple should talk to Microsoft, talk to, the NBA to get some information, get some experience, and they should get together and try to promote a code of conduct together for dealing with China. How, they should have come up with common standards that would make it more difficult for Beijing to ostracize those who stand up for basic rights. As I said, the Chinese government can't get rid of all foreign companies. If they band together, they really have much more leverage, and they should do that.
Strength in numbers, right? Which also leads to grassroots numbers. And I know, SFT and World Uyghur Congress and different grassroots aspects can really play a big part with Apple, with other companies. And so I wonder if anyone wants to speak to, sorry, I'm rocking my chair. If anyone wants to speak to how the grassroots can be involved right now. We're in a bit of a moment that none of us could have imagined, right? With the pandemic having happened, oftentimes, protests at stores and things like that, but the stores were all closed, So we're in this world right now where we're figuring out how to leverage grassroots power with Apple and in general. I wonder if folks can talk about that, like how people can best get involved moving forward with this campaign.
Yeah, I can start that off for you, Kathy. So as some of the viewers might know, SFT hosted with World Uyghur Congress and Keep Taiwan Free and other members of our coalition group a grassroots concert event on Saturday to increase the discussion, get young people talking about this issue of censorship and free expression in the way that it connects to Apple. We had about nearly 1,500 or so viewers, tuning in for the concert here and there from around the world. And I think that as we continue the conversation, as how Yachio was saying, it's not just about one individual tech company. It's about the idea that all people in the grassroots should understand that this is an important topic, and that in particular, the leaders at Apple should understand that it's not about the idea that they need to do business in China and that's why they're making these decisions. It's rather about they have customers and they have consumers around the world. They have people that are loyal to their brand around the world, and many of these people would not support the decisions that they've made currently inside areas that are inside the Great Firewall. So the more that the grassroots know about what's going on, the more that this idea that we've been talking about today, that human rights is good for profit, that only is true if the people that are consuming these products know about the human rights situations, because the more that Apple can kind of put these under the rug and individuals, grassroots members and supporters from around the world don't know about these human rights concerns and Apple's complicity in censorship, then, you know, Apple can, again, as I said earlier, eat their cake and have it too. So what we want to do is create a situation in which there is, you know, more transparency in places where we have freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and the grassroots consumers, the activists, the supporters that have their MacBooks and their iPhones know about Apple's complicity and can then actually join the campaign and join the voice in calling on Apple to, you know, as a brand that we are, you know, we are using, a brand that we use for, you know, creating art, a brand that we use for sharing our message of, you know, climate, you know, the climate action, or any human rights cause, or any, you know, social cause. For people that support those causes, many of them actually use their Apple products to further those causes, and they would not want to hear that Apple is in any way complicit with silencing or censoring those causes, or actually, you know, causing real harm on people in more vulnerable areas. So I think that the idea that the grassroots is like needs to know about what's going on with this campaign is crucial to linking, you know, human rights and profits as a joint thing. Like the more profits, the more human rights transparency we have, the more the profits will actually improve. Like we need to create that link between the two.
In general, I think Beijing's effort to inflame nationalism at home and intimidate multinational companies into towing the party's line, it's something that we have to tell the users of Apple, because many people in free countries, they don't actually understand when they are using Apple products, they're actually endorsing a company that violates human rights or is indirectly or directly involved in surveillance and censorship and violations of human rights. And this is something that I think we need more discussion and more exposure on. Is most of the time, even Hong Kongers, they are not aware of that Apple is actually playing a role in hindering their own fundamental rights. And this is something that we need to do more education on. At the same time, as ordinary citizens, I think there seems to be not much that we can do, because Apples are such monopolies that we don't really have many other choices if we don't use Apple products. And sometimes due to our work nature or different like that, we are forced to use Apple products and we don't have a choice. But at the same time, I think there are other things that we can do. For example, we can educate citizens that there are other options. For example, there are open sources options for different things, and by using or engaging in those services, they can actually use less of those who are provided by monopolies like Google and Apple. And there are many things that we can do. For example, we can practice better information security practices that will allow us to have more privacy under mass surveillance that is going to happen in Hong Kong. In general, we need to do more promotion and education in what it actually means when we use Apple products or when we buy Apple products, because that actually is endorsing a company that violates human rights, and that needs to change right now. And we have to make sure that Apple and other monopolies feel the pressure that they have to change their approach of submitting to China's
We seem to be losing Glacier, but oh, you're back. We lost you a little at the very end there. We need to keep the pressure on Apple is where we ended.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's,
and I think
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I think for citizens, we have to put more pressure on Apple and make sure that we know when we are making an active choice of using Apple products, we are endorsing the systematical violation of human rights that the Communist Party commits, and it's not acceptable, and it's a moral problem. It's more than this product or that product is making a moral choice. We want to endorse something that upholds a double standard in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And I think in there is an interesting aspect too, that we often think of power as being from the top down. Like Apple is saying that too. They're saying, oh, the Chinese government has all the power. We have nothing we can do. And we as people often think, oh, we don't have power, because it does seem really big and huge. But we can also flip that on its head and know that when we have lots of pieces, and as we mentioned before, lots of corporations coming together, there's sort of a mirror. We have that for our own grassroots as well. And that power can actually come from the bottom up. And we actually, in those numbers, actually really do have power. And we just have to figure out how to speak to these companies in a way that really opens their ears, that they really hear it, like how to move them. And I think that's our job as people, to help mobilize and engage and really inspire people to get involved.
And I think as well, we're at a really interesting point where that mobilization is kind of ours for the taking, really. I've been quite encouraged and surprised to see the depth and the spread of anti-racist campaigning over the past few weeks, both in the US and in Europe. And I've worked in anti-racism for some years, and I've never really seen this level of engagement. And I know there's lots of pontificating to be done about, is this because of lockdowns, because of COVID-19, and people are confronted with their own mortality, or inside more and not part of that capitalist consumerist machine because all the shops are closed. And people have learnt their power, I think. They've shown that protests can work and can cause companies to change their ways, and for those in power to do things differently, with actions to defund police forces, etc., across the US. And so I don't think it's a huge step for more people to become aware of how the companies that are rushing to laud and to put themselves in a good light in these protests, like Apple, to really hold them to account for the ways in which they collude with equally dreadful human rights abuses elsewhere in the world. And maybe we say we can't, we can no longer do protests outside stores because stores are closed, but maybe that's also an opportunity, in that people can't just shop their way out of not thinking about what's happening in the world around them. They can make more conscious choices. They have more time to consider those choices that they're making. We've come a long way, I think, in this campaign in over, less than a year, really. I think it was July when we first launched it. So I think there's a lot of possibilities going forward, and there's a lot of challenges going forward as well. But in some ways, companies like Apple are kind of making it easy for us by stepping up and saying these grandiose things, these grandiose words, and we can quite easily point to where that isn't, where they're not living up to those.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add into this part?
Yeah, I know I had already added earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Adding on to what Shonda's kind of been talking about, I think it really is that shift in Apple's brand. I think, like, near the beginning of the talk today, Yacho had mentioned about Yahoo and the impact that one decision by Yahoo had on their long-term brand. I think that's the kind of decision that Apple is facing right now. Do they want to risk this long-term impact on their brand? I mean, if you look at companies like Facebook, after the situation that Facebook has been going through in the past several years, as a society, there is very little trust or respect for Facebook's integrity in terms of these moral and social questions and these issues of transparency. And when it comes to Apple today, amongst most young people who are, a huge consumer base and also consumer target that Apple actually aims for particularly, I think that we have to think about what that long-term shift or that gradual shift in the brand of Apple is going to look like in the coming years. If Apple doesn't, step up and take a decision in the current time, I think it's going to have an extremely negative impact on their brand.
We talked about the grassroots campaigns. I was thinking that what the governments can do. when Google was contemplating the Dragonfly project, tried to re-enter China, Google CEO Pichai was summoned to the Congress to give a testimony, and that was powerful image of Google being questioned for its actions during the Yahoo's handling the information, which resulted to 2 journalists being sentenced to 10 years. I still remember, those images of Yahoo CEO at that time. Jerry Yang was summoned to Congress to basically say, why did I do that? I mean, government can also play a role to pressure bigger companies not to comply with the so-called Chinese laws, and to stand up to the Chinese government and stand up for human rights.
But I think the approach really depends on how willing is the government in order to do that, because it's impossible that the Hong Kong government will summon, or the Chinese government will summon these CEOs of big tech companies and ask them why are they giving out users' data, and it's mainly up to the US or the Europe to do so. And I think after the COVID-19, I fear that they don't have much incentive to do that because of the economy into.
So while we're waiting for Glacier's glitch, Shonda, you had something to say too, yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Pema's point about Apple's sort of brand value, and I think sometimes we get caught in this idea that in order for it to be effective, we need to boycott Apple, we need to go to other brands. But I think we forget that the tremendous power we have around Apple's desirability, and hence its kind of value and the goodwill. There's the goodwill concept that shareholders do look at, investors look at, that's a little less tangible, a little less measurable. But we, as a society, give Apple desirability by those long queues as soon as an new iPhone is released. People want to be the first one to get that iPhone. And that gives Apple a lot of free publicity and a lot of cachet. It wouldn't take much to threaten Apple's position if that, it suddenly wasn't so desirable. You didn't necessarily want to be the first person getting that iPhone or join that queue on the day of release, because Apple's, morals were a little bit shady now, and we know that what they've been doing in China and countries that are ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. So it's not a huge shift in moving necessarily not stopping using Apple products entirely, but just denting that veneer of desirability and respectability that the company has as a market leader.
I do agree with Shania and Pema. It's not a question of boycotting these products, because we all, I'm sure we all own Apple products. I mean, all of my products are Apple. So I think we as consumers really have power and leverage in kind of shifting the narrative to I am an Apple consumer, and I expect more from you as a brand, as a global brand, to do better in these circumstances, in these contexts, because I am giving my money, but I don't want you to take my money and then go abuse human rights elsewhere. So I think as consumers, we have not only responsibility, but also good leverage on these companies.
Yes, for sure. And I think one thing I want to bring in here, we have just about 6 minutes left. I like this notion of people not necessarily wanting to be the first in line to get their iPhone, because maybe there's a little bit shady here. And one of the things we talk about in the campaign, and when we look at Apple's transparency report for what they are doing in their app store, the VPNs that they're pulling by the request of what government, to call their transparency report transparent is quite amusing if it weren't so horrible, because they are not being transparent at all about what they're pulling. They simply, as many know, they just say illegal content, mostly gambling and pornography. But what we know is that so many of those are security apps. They are life-saving apps. And so I wonder if people can speak to that in terms of really trying to break open this transparency piece so that there is a light shining more on what exactly is happening. And the shareholder resolution does that, but maybe there's some other ways as well that we can really let people see what is actually happening. Shonda, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that with the shareholder meeting in particular. Yeah, the resolution.
I can talk about the share. I was also going to raise another point, which is something that we've been seeing more of this week, is developers themselves speaking out about Apple's policies and practices around the App Store. And, you know, these are people who have, and companies that have made Apple what it is and made Apple rich and given this user experience. And so I think it'd be interesting to see how that conversation develops, and you know, maybe we can encourage developers to demand answers to why their apps have been removed, and more details about why that, you know, to break open that lack of transparency. Certainly a result with the shareholder proposal would also help to do that, because we'd ask Apple to have a statement on its commitment to freedom of expression, and to have practices and policies in place that would assess the human rights impact, or the impact on negative impact of freedom of expression that its business decisions would have, and the policies they put in place, or the mitigating steps they put in place to prevent that from happening. So there would be much less space for Apple to hide, and to decline to share this information if it's a report that shareholders have demanded. If their shareholders vote for it, that's what they've asked for, so they can assess the risk to Apple's business and where they want to put their money, and hold Apple accountable through that route.
Anyone else want to add anything to that, or have any other questions that you want to throw out there? Throw out some closing thoughts in our last few minutes here.
Yeah, to close, I can just add that I think, in particular, what Students for Free Tibet really, I think thinks is one of the most crucial parts of this campaign is mobilizing young people. You know, I've said it several times throughout this panel today. I think it's that Apple really cares about their brand, and Shonda had also mentioned about that. Apple is probably one of the brands that cares the most about what people think about, you know, their view, their behaviors and their actions, and in particular their human rights values. And I think that the reason why Apple cares so much about this is because young people, young consumers, look for brands that match their values and reflect what they believe in and reflect what they want to see in the world. And when you think about a brand like Apple, I think what Apple has done a really good job at is presenting themselves as, you know, the consumer, the socially conscious option, the choice where you get, you know, the high tech, sleek, fancy, pretty item, which also comes with, you know, all the great, you know, social causes, a CEO that cares about and respects, you know, human rights. And I think that what we can see is that this is an image, a facade that Apple has intentionally created, actually, very smartly so. And so one of the best things that we can do, as you know, in our campaign, is to continue building a movement in which young people know about what's going on inside Tibet, inside East Turkestan, and in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, you know, we can only imagine that this situation will get much worse in the coming months or years as the national security laws rolled out. We've seen it in Tibet, the way that, you know, the provincial secretary, Chuang Guo, was moved from Tibet to East Turkestan. We saw some of the policies being carried over, the grid system, the surveillance, and a lot of those things. I think that China is one of those, CCP is one of those regimes that takes what it learns in one region and applies it to another to silence the people. And what we've seen inside Tibet and in East Turkestan in how they use technology to censor and surveil freedom of expression, we can only expect that this is what they're looking for in Hong Kong as well. So, I think as the freedom of expression and Stop Apple Censorship campaign is much bigger than just about, a handful of apps. It's about the future of what technology will look like. As I mentioned earlier, 10, 20, 30 years from now, will technology be this beacon of hope and, freedom that people all thought it would be in the 90s? Or will it be something that's linked with oppression and the further controlling and silencing of free voices? I think that's a decision that Apple thinks they're making, but actually we are the ones who get to make that. And the way we make that decision is by, making sure we know about what these tech leaders are up to, and making sure the other people in our social network know what these tech companies are up to. So thanks everyone that tuned in, and I hope that we can continue spreading the message that we, discussed a lot at the panel today.
I have one really short remarks. It's the whole campaign of stopping Apple censorship. It's like sweatshop campaigns. It takes a lot of time to raise awareness for consumers to understand the impact of their choices, and it's really important that we keep talking about these things. And I think impact will take a lot of time to really see actual changes in Apple policies, but it's like sweatshop campaigns that we eventually see some changes in the company behavior with enough momentum from the press, from the civil society, and from consumers themselves. And I really think that especially Hong Kong, Tibet, or Taiwan, they really need the help from the international community, because we are facing increasing oppression like we never had, and it's very dangerous, and we need everybody's attention in these situations. I sincerely hope that these kind of campaigns to fight against censorship from tech companies will eventually become like sweatshop campaigns, that they will eventually and slowly succeed. And I really look forward for that to happen.
Yeah, and this group of people here is so representative of just the power and grit and smartness in this campaign. I feel super inspired talking to you all. And I think a lot of what we have been talking about is in motion in terms of governments getting involved. When HK Map Live was pulled, some officials here, wrote to Apple about it. So I think we have so much potential amongst us, and I'm really excited for everybody listening to just keep going with this campaign. And if folks remember that Apple used to have a campaign with the Dalai Lama that said, "Think different." And so we are definitely calling on them to think different here. Let's, get it done. So without further ado, I thank everyone here, and we're going to close this out. And as we speak now, a hackathon is starting to answer some questions around Apple censorship that will help the campaign move forward. That's very exciting. And then there's one more panel later, and a developer from Hong Kong Live will be there, and a Tibetan developer, and a Great Fire developer, and Guardian project. And so stay tuned for that in about an hour. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for having us. Bye.